Welcome back, everybody, to the theory of evolution versus creation. I hope you enjoyed my last video, and if you haven't seen it, I would recommend you watch that before you watch this one, because there's just some foundational things that we go over that this video builds upon, and so video will make more sense if you've watched the previous one. So I'll just dive right into it. Charles Darwin lived from 1809 to 1882, and he wrote The Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. That was the full title of his book that he wrote in 1859. And this drastically pulled modern culture away from the biblical creation to the theory of evolution. Notice that last part of the title of his book. It's kind of like the subtitle. It says, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Just keep that in mind, because we're going to go through that later on in this video, and it's an important detail that is often left out of the title of his book, and I don't blame people for leaving it out because of what it speaks to. So anyway, we'll get into that, but basically Darwin believed that all of life had a common ancestor instead of a common designer. And this was greatly inspired by the writings of Charles Lyell, the man I talked about in the last video. So armed with the theory of uniformitarianism, which gave the notion of millions of years, previously everyone believed the Earth was only thousands of years old, but with the theory of uniformitarianism, they were now beginning to believe it was millions of years old. Darwin laid his theory of evolution on this uniformitarianism foundation. And so after all, without millions of years, evolution completely crumbles. Time actually becomes the magical god of evolution, and given enough of it, they believe that anything is possible. So Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and this helped him formulate his ideas on natural selection. He found several species of a finch bird that had adapted to different environmental niches. And so the finches also differed in beak shape, food source, and how food was captured. This observation helped Darwin formulate his ideas on natural selection. And so he's witnessing these different finches that have these beaks that are different sizes. And he's realizing that they have adapted to their environment a little bit differently. And keep in mind here, guys, that he's observing finches. They're all the same species. They're all birds. He's not seeing something transform into another animal or another kind of animal. They all just have a bit of a different beak because they've adapted. And I mentioned this in my first video, that this is due to a loss of information, not a gaining of information. And so to go from one animal kind to another animal kind would be a tremendous gaining of information, which is what we don't witness. We witness the loss of it. And so this is actually something he observed. In his first edition on the Origin of Species that he wrote in 1859, Charles Darwin speculated about how natural selection could cause a land mammal such as a black bear to turn into a whale. I am not lying. This is what he thought. So now he's taking his theory about how these little beaks have kind of adapted to their environment, still all within a bird family, but they've all adapted to their environment in a unique way. And so he's thinking now, armed again with the theory of uniformitarianism, that the world is millions or even billions of years old. Well, we haven't got to billions of years yet by this time, but he's believing it's millions of years old, that given enough time, one animal could absolutely transform into another animal. And he looked at the black bear and thought, hey, maybe that's how whales came to be today. And he actually wrote this in his book, and he said, I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered, by natural selection, more adequate to their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till the creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. He speculated. And so the idea didn't go over very well with the public. Darwin was so embarrassed by the ridicule that he received from the swimming black bear passage that it was actually moved from later editions of his book. And so Darwin saw how a black bear swam through the water with its mouth open to eat insects. And he thought, man, if you give this enough time, I bet you that black bear turned into a whale. And again, I mean, people did obviously give him a lot of grief for it, and so he did remove it, but we have not moved very far from that idea. In fact, in today's so-called science, we know so much more than Darwin did about how whales really came to be. And how much more do we know? Well, let me quote to you from a science website that is regarding this topic. And this is the quote from the website. Scientists now know that Darwin had the right idea, but the wrong animal. So he was close, but he missed it. He had the wrong animal. Instead of looking at bears, he should have been looking instead at cows and hippopotamuses. The story of the origin of whales is one of the most fascinating tales and one of the best examples scientists have of natural selection. End quote. You are looking at one of the best examples evolutionary science has of how whales came to be. They used to be a cow, and for some reason that cow decided to have its nostrils go way back on its head. It then decided to have its legs turn into flippers, and somehow those big hind legs and the udder turned into a big, massive tail. And if you don't like that one, well, then go for the hippopotamus, because that's just as logical. So I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I cannot help it, because this is honestly what evolution believes. And here's the problem, guys. Well, there's many problems, but here's the glaringly obvious one, and I mentioned this in my first video. We do not find one transitional fossil of a hippopotamus or a cow coming anywhere near turning into a whale. Nowhere near anything like that. We don't find it. It's not in the dirt. And so you cannot tell me that this is science. You can tell me it's a religion, and you can tell me you need faith to believe it, and I would respect you for that, because then you'd be telling the truth. You need faith to believe this, guys. There is not scientific evidence of this. There's just assumptions, there's theories, and there's a lot of faith. No evidence. And so this is really the Darwinian evolution. And I'm now going to go through with you guys how it came into our school system, how it came into our culture, and the effects that it has had. So I just went through how Darwin kind of progressed in his theory, obviously in a very simple way, kind of in layman's terms. I am going to elaborate it, obviously, in much more detail as we progress. I just wanted to give you a really simple view of what this really is and what they believe and the lack of evidence that they have for it. And if I could be brutally honest, it's, in my opinion, ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. I don't even have really words. Like to actually believe this just requires an enormous amount of faith that I just frankly don't have. And so moving on. A public school textbook in 1908 literally read, so this is what the school system used to be: God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. It also says that prayer is a duty, but it is vain to pray without sincere desire of heart. And then it also says, and God governs the world in infinite wisdom. This was before evolutionary teaching hit the schools. This was public school textbooks. The belief of God was so accepted, the belief in the Bible and creation was so accepted in our culture that they taught it in their schools. They taught creation as science in their schools. But what happened is something began to change in the 50s. So in the beginning, in the beginning of the 50s, 1950s, the average textbook in America had only 2,000 to 3,000 words about evolution in them. So not a ton, not very much. However, something began to happen in 1957 when the Americans began to lose the race against the Russians to get a satellite into space. And so needing something or someone to blame for this, the Americans were losing against the Russians, and they were, obviously been embarrassed by it, so they need to blame someone. So the Americans were taught that the Soviets were ahead of them in the realm of science because they taught evolution in their school system. This came out of Life magazine, September 15th, 1960. What evolution has to do with putting a satellite into space, I have no idea. It's a good question. But it honestly evolution became the scapegoat for why the Americans were losing the war against Russia in getting a satellite into space. And so they needed to blame something, so they blamed, well, you know what? The Russians are teaching evolution in their schools. We're not teaching it at ours. We're behind the times. We're not scientifically accurate in our schools, and that's why we're losing. And so on the 100th anniversary of the release of Charles Darwin's book on evolution in 1959, President Eisenhower requests $1 billion from Congress to go towards the funding of evolution in public schools. It was granted, and $10,500,000 of that went to the NSF, which is the National Science Foundation, to fund a new 9-part themed curriculum teaching evolution. And so, I mean, keep in mind, guys, 1959, $1 billion, that is, I mean, it's a lot today. Back then, it was incredible, an incredible amount of resource to be putting into getting evolution into the school system. And so, I kid you not, literal lies were placed into the textbook, heralding the theory of evolution as fact and leaving no room for any other narrative. Later on, I will go through the number of these straight-up lies that we actually find in the textbooks, and they're still in our textbooks today. And I'm going to go through those in detail and show you that I'm not making this up. There are literal lies in our science textbooks today where I believe kids are not being educated, they're being indoctrinated. And that is exactly what I see happening to students across the board, where they're getting indoctrinated, not educated. And I will actually prove that to you as we move on. And so they actually had a name for this new reformation of the educational system. They called it the Cold War Reconstruction of American Science Education. That was the name for it. And so by 1963, evolution hits the public school system, teaching that we are not created by God, but rather evolved from soup and have a rock as a common ancestor. This, of course, then meant we have no value, we have no worth, we have no meaning. You are simply a fluke of random cells coming together. Morality is up to the individual, and the Bible is a nice story. If there's no God, then there is no one to answer to, and anyone can do what feels right to them at any time. And this is what it was in the same year that prayer was actually taken out of the schools. So evolution comes in, and God gets kicked out. And we see the what I call again the indoctrination into evolution before and after federal funding. And so this opened up our culture to moral relativism, which has disastrous effects as we will see and as we continue to see today. If evolution were really true, then again, guys, we have absolutely no value, no purpose, no meaning, no worth. The strong rule the weak. And they went from having 2,000 to 3,000 words concerning evolution in their school system, in their textbooks, and in their teaching, up to over 33,000 words. So this was, again, because of Eisenhower funding this and completely bringing reformation to the school system. So this reminds me of this verse in Judges 17:6, what we're about to see, and the effects of this teaching. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. How you feel that day becomes the new standard, and no one can tell you you're right or wrong. You are just, like I said, a very lucky lump of cells trying to survive, and when you die, who cares but those who are close to you? Weak things are supposed to die so that the strong survive. In a moment, I'll show you the whole evolutionary way of thinking, which actually led Hitler to justify what he did in World War II. Now, you might think that's a strong statement, but I'll show you in this video just how strong the impact of evolution has been on our culture. And guys, I just wanted to quote this from Jesus. He says, a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And so why don't we take a look at the fruit of evolution? Why don't we see how it's impacted our society? After 1963 and evolution invades the textbooks and the school system, STDs went up 226%. Babies born from premarital sex went up 100%, and pregnancies went up 553%. The difference between those numbers is the ones who were aborted. Now, as you can see in this graph, it's obviously, from 1963 over to 1975. I mean, it takes time to collect this data, but you can see that the STDs begin to skyrocket after the teaching of evolution hits the textbooks. Illegal drug use by youth in less than 20 years went up 6,000%. Now keep in mind, this is also during the 60s, and so there was a lot of drugs and stuff going on in the 60s anyway, so I'm not attributing all of this to evolution. Any of these stats, I'm not attributing all of it to evolution. There are obviously many factors, but it is not a coincidence to me that when you begin to teach people that there is no God we're accountable to, that morality is relative, and you can kind of do whatever is right in your own eyes, that there's no purpose to your life, there's no value to your life, you don't really mean anything, and the strong rule the weak. We're going to see that impact our culture. We're going to see that way of thinking and that mindset absolutely affect our kids who are learning this in schools. And we're going to see how it affects them as they continue to grow up. And so we see these spikes after 1963. So I'm not attributing all of this to evolution. That would be foolish to do so. But it absolutely is a key factor. Here we see child abuse goes up 2,300% from 1963 up until just over 1980. It went up 2,300%. Violent crime offenses, this went up 995% between 1963 and 1990. And notice the population growth line there. That's that little black line. This is not due to a growth in population. That is not factored into this in the sense of that's why it went up. No, it's way beyond the population growth. And so again, if we're being taught that you can do whatever's right in your own eyes, what do you expect? I mean, this isn't shocking, really. Divorce rates also were actually going down until 1962, and then after 1963, they start spiking up again. Teen suicide rates also skyrocket after 1963. And is that surprising? If you don't have any value and there's no meaning to life, and you're just a random lump of cells that's lucky to be here, but you have no purpose, think about what that does to the psyche of a human. Think about what that does. I mean, some of the biggest question every soul struggles with is, what is my purpose? Why am I here? What is life all about? What's the purpose of life? And evolution absolutely strips that down to being worthless and to be meaning nothing. Your life's not worth anything. And so, of course, we're going to see this kind of stuff happen. And now I want to look at the school system. You know, there's a kid named Kip Kinkle in 1998, and he said this. He said, if there was a God, he wouldn't let me feel the way I do. There is no God, only hate. 15-year-old Kip Kinkle walked into his school on May 21st, 1998 and fired more than 50 rounds from a semi-automatic rifle, killing 2 students and injuring 26. The bodies of his parents were later found at home. None of this stuff was taking place before evolution was taught in schools. And again, I'm not attributing all this to evolution. I'm just saying that it is going to have an impact on how the kids see themselves and on the value that they think their life has, or better yet, doesn't have according to evolution. So there have been an average of 10 school shootings per year since the Columbine shooting of 1999. And that recently went up to almost an average of 1 school shooting per week. And that was in the year of 2019, because the year of 2020, we obviously had the pandemic and it wasn't school as usual. But in 2019, there was an average of 1 school shooting per week in America. So the massacre at the Columbine High School took place on April 20th, 1999, where 1 teacher and 12 students were killed and 21 people injured by 2 teens named Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. I probably pronounced the first boy's name wrong, but anyway, Dylan. The 2 boys made a video prior to the shooting, and they are quoted as saying of one of the guys on the football team that he didn't deserve the jawbone evolution gave him. Look for his jaw, it won't be on his body. That's what they said in a pre-recorded video before they walked into the school and started shooting. Heavily influenced by the theory of evolution. Both these boys' parents were atheists who believed in evolution, and the boys carried out this attack on Hitler's birthday on purpose. They spoke German to each other in the halls and asked different students if they believed in God, shooting and killing them when they said yes. Eric Harris wore a t-shirt that said natural selection. I'll say it again, and I'm not solely blaming evolution for these strategies, but it would be mistaken to not acknowledge its influence, especially when the guy's walking through the halls wearing a shirt that says natural selection. So anyway, these are just the stats from America, since the introduction of evolutionary teaching hit the school system. But what about its impact on the world? So now we're going to take a look at the role evolution has had in some of the worst leaders in recent history. Now again, I just have to keep reiterating this, that evolution, of course, is not solely to blame for what we're about to see next, but it is the common thread woven throughout these men's actions and their worldviews. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. He was a German socialist revolutionary, and he's kind of known as the spiritual father of the communism system. So Marx was an avid adherent of Darwin. He combined his social and economic idea with evolutionary principles. And Marx wrote that Darwin's book contains, quote, the basis in natural history for our views. He's saying this is the standpoint and the viewpoint that we should have. This is how it came to be, and so we can basically do whatever we want. The strong rule the weak. His disciple Lenin applied utter ruthlessness and terror in Russia. The term rivers of blood has commonly been applied to describing his reign. And so in 2017, there was a professor named Stephen Kotkin. And he wrote in the Wall Street Journal that communism killed at least 65 million people between 1917 and 2017. Though communism has killed huge numbers of people intentionally, even more of its victims have died from starvation as a result of its cruel projects of social engineering. So Leon lived from 1879 to 1940. And he was a Russian evolutionary fanatically committed to Darwinism and Marxism. He's a communist leader that was brutal against the Christian church. He said that Darwin's ideas intoxicated him. And, quote, Darwin stood for me like a mighty doorkeeper at the entrance to the temple of the universe, unquote. With no creator's laws to restrain him and the justification of evolution, he felt free to use any means to attain power and to whatever political end. And so Joseph Stalin has lived 1879 to 1953. He's one of the world's top mass murderers, and he studied in Georgia, a theological college. A friend later said that Stalin became an atheist after reading Darwin. He was expelled from college at 19 because of his revolutionary connections. After understanding that evolution provided no basis for conscience or morals, he felt free to torture and murder to whatever extent he chose to achieve his communistic goals in the Soviet Union. And so modern data for the whole of Stalin's rule was summarized by Timothy Snyder, who concluded that Stalinism caused 6 million direct deaths and 9 million in total, including the deaths of deportation, starvation, and also included 14,700 Polish prisoners of war who he executed. And here we get to Adolf Hitler. And a lot of people don't know this, and it's so important to point out because evolution is actually a foundation for racism. People battled each other in different ethnicities before evolution. There wasn't the racism as we know it today. Evolutionary thinking brought that about. And I'm going to explain that in just one second. But Adolf Hitler formed his racial and social policies on the evolutionary ideas of survival of the fittest and the superiority of certain favored races. Remember the subtitle of Darwin's book that I brought up that a lot of people don't quote. They just say the origin of species. But it also, one of the subtitles is of favored races in the struggle for life. And so Hitler's reign resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews, as well as many blacks, gypsies, and the mentally disabled and other groups deemed unfit to live. The evolutionary science of eugenetics provided him with the justification for his decrees. So Hitler's worldview, as outlined in his book, Hitler wrote a book called Mein Kampf, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right because it's German, but it literally means my struggle. Hitler believed that people, like animals and plants, were engaged in a constant struggle for survival. The climax of history would be the survival of the fittest race, which he believed to be the Aryan race, as embodied in the German people. So Hitler literally believed that the Aryan race, the Germans, had evolved further than any other race. And he got that from Darwin. He got that from evolutionary thinking. And that is what justified him to kill Jews and black people, gypsies, people who were disabled because they were weak, people who wore glasses, people who couldn't speak right, people who had handicaps. He slaughtered them because they were getting in the way of evolution. And so this is where Hitler got his idea from. And this is how he justified it. And quite frankly, I just don't really hear people acknowledge that. And yet it's common knowledge that this did happen. Well, sorry, it's not common. I just said a lot of people don't acknowledge it, but I think it's common knowledge in the sense that a lot of people know about it, but there's just a lot of people that just never talk about it. Because if we really look at the fruit of evolution, we don't like where it leads. But this is exactly where believing in evolution leads. This is exactly what it justifies. And so now we get to Mao Zedong. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, sorry guys, but he lived from 1893 to 1976. So this is China's notorious chairman who is known to have regarded Darwin and Darwin's disciple Huxley as his two favorite authors. He outdid Hitler and Stalin by being responsible for the death of 45 million people between 1958 and 1962. It was an absolute bloodbath. In 4 years, he killed over 45 million people. And again, this wasn't solely because of evolution, but he was also highly influenced by evolutionary thinking. And that, when you think about it, it just justifies so much. So the last one is Pol Pot. Pol Pot lived from 1925 to 1998. He's a Cambodian politician. The death in 1998 of Cambodian's Pol Pot marked the end of one of the world's worst mass murders. From 1975 to 1979, he led the Khmer Rouge, probably saying that wrong as well, but sorry, to genocide against his own people in a bloodthirsty regime which was inspired by the communism of Stalin and China's notorious Mao Zedong. They executed 1/3 of the Cambodian population. 1/3 of it. Again, another mass murder heavily influenced by Darwinism. Hitler's understanding of the history of life and that of Marx, Stalin, and Mao was not devised by a German, Russian, or Chinese person. It was shaped by an Englishman named Charles Darwin. Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life, laid the groundwork for their worldviews. They each applied the principle of survival of the fittest to their own situations. For Marx and Stalin, it was a class struggle. For Hitler, it was a racial struggle. And because Darwinism undermined the authority of the Bible and its origins, it meant that, logically, there was no accountability to God for the mass murder they used to implement their ideas. In fact, such tactics could be justified by Darwinism. Without an absolute standard of right and wrong, those in power are not accountable to any standard. And so might becomes what's right. That's what evolution believes. As Darwin's evolutionary thinking became widely welcomed and absorbed by society, it not only convinced leaders like Marx and Hitler, but it became the scientific framework justifying the public acceptance of their actions for the benefit of all humanity. And so all these mass murders reveal what it looks like when evolution becomes the belief system of a society and makes death the hero that cleanses the human race. That's what so many of them were doing. They were cleansing the human race, and especially Hitler was trying to speed up this so-called process of evolution by eliminating the weak races that were getting in his way. And so just as a reminder here, guys, we have Jesus quoting in John 10:1-10. He says, "The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy, but I have come that you may have life and that you may have it to the full." And 1 Corinthians 15, I quoted this in the last video, it says, "For he, Jesus, must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet." The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Right here, guys, in John 10:10, we have the two job descriptions of God and the enemy. God comes to bring life and life abundantly. The enemy comes to rob, kill, and destroy. And looking back over these number of men that we looked at, what job description do you think they fell into? What fruit came out of what they believed? And in that case, what fruit has come from believing in evolution? Because this is the kind of thing it justifies. And we need to be very aware of this and call it out for what it is. Because that is where that path leads when we take it to its end route. When we go to the end of that road, we just witnessed where it leads. And so I know this was a heavier video, guys. I promise that they're not all going to be like this. In fact, this was the heaviest one for sure. In the next video, I'm going to get into the science of things. I'm going to break things down. I'm going to show you lies in the textbooks that we still have in our textbooks today. They are straight up lies about evolution, claiming things as fact that have already been proven false, and they have not been taken out. And so we're going to get into that. I think you'll find it a lot more interesting and a lot more lighthearted. And so yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. And like I said before, guys, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, please feel free to put them in the comment section below. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next video.